in 17 campaigns across 6 star systems. He had killed enemies that would make less species lose their minds from fear alone. He stood 8 feet tall, and his scales could step a blade. His people, though, were known across the galaxy as warriors without equal. So when Command told him that human soldiers were coming to help them fight the Dread Collective, he laughed. He actually laughed out loud in front of his superior officer. Humans were small and soft and frail, on a single world for most of their history, and had only joined the galactic community 40 years ago. They were children playing at war while the real powers of the galaxy did the actual fighting. Commander did not share his amusement. The commander looked tired in a way that had never seen before. 3 years of fighting the Dread Collective on IV had broken something in the old warrior. They were losing this war, and everyone did. The collective kept sending more soldiers, and they kept running out of them. So when the humans offered to send a company of their marines, Command accepted. Thought it was shameful. He thought it was an insult to every who had died on the cursed planet. But orders were orders, and he kept his mouth shut after that first laugh. The transport ship landed on a morning when the sky was full of smoke from the burning forest to the north. Stood with his squad and watched the rear doors open. He expected to see fear on their faces. He expected them to look around at the destruction and the bodies and the sound of distant explosions and show some sign of doubt. The first human to step off the ship was a male of average height with short brown hair and calm eyes. Combat armor that looked almost primitive compared to equipment. He carried a rifle that seemed like a toy, but his eyes were not the eyes of a child or a fool. He scanned the landing zone with a practiced gaze that recognized. This human had seen war before. The male walked straight up to Commander and saluted in the human fashion. His name was, and he held the rank of sergeant. Behind him came 30 more humans of various sizes and appearances. Males and females mixed together, which still seemed strange too. Among them was a female with dark hair pulled back tight against her skull. Her name was Lieutenant M. Price, and she was the tactical officer for the unit. She had in one hand, and she was already studying the terrain map before her boots touched the ground. Ren assigned in his squad to work directly with the human. Did not hide his displeasure. He towered over by nearly 3 feet and outweighed him by at least 200 pounds. The idea that the small creature could fight beside him was absurd. Seemed to notice his contempt but said nothing about it. He simply asked practical questions about enemy positions and patrol routes and supply lines. His voice was calm and his questions were intelligent. Because he had to, not because he wanted to. The first 2 days passed without incident. The humans set up their equipment and learned the layout of forward base theta. They ran drills and checked their weapons and studied the intelligence reports on the Dread Collective. Watched them and saw nothing impressive. They were organized and professional, but so were many species in the galaxy. They did not seem special in any way. Third night, everything changed. The Dread Collective hit forward base theta with a force 3 times larger than anything they had used before. The first explosion came without warning and was thrown from his sleeping platform by the blast. He grabbed his weapon and ran outside in chaos. The sky was on fire. Enemy soldiers were pouring through breaches in the defensive walls. Warriors were falling everywhere he looked. And in the middle of it all, he saw the formed a tight line near the eastern wall where the fighting was heaviest. Was at the center of that line, and he was firing his weapon with mechanical precision. Each shot found a target. Each movement was efficient and controlled. But that was not what made stop and stare. A Dread Collective blade had cut across his left arm and blood was running down to his fingers. The wound was deep enough to see bone, and he would have fallen back to get medical. The same creature would have recognized that they were compromised and needed to withdraw. Did not fall back. He did not even look at his arm. He kept firing. He kept killing. Way toward the human line because that seemed to be where the battle was being decided. He saw M. Price pulling a wounded soldier to cover while firing her sidearm with her other hand. He saw a young human male take a hit to his chest armor that should have put him down, but the human just grunted and kept fighting. The Dread Collective pushed harder and knew they were going to be overrun. He had seen enough battles to know when a position was lost. Humans did not seem to understand this. They did not retreat. They did not even slow down. Shouted something in his human language and his soldiers answered with a sound that had never heard before. It was not a war cry exact. It was something deeper and more primal. It was the sound of creatures who had decided that they were not going to stop no matter what happened. The Dread Collective actually hesitated, saw it happen. The soldiers who had been charging forward suddenly slowed as if they sensed something wrong. And in that moment of hesitation, the humans pushed back. They pushed back against a force that outnumbered them 10 to 1, and they did not stop pushing until the enemy retreated. The battle was overstood among the dead and the dying, and he looked at the humans with new eyes, was finally letting a mech treat his arm. His face was pale from blood loss, but his expression was calm. And Price was already organizing the defense for the next attack. The other humans were checking on the wound and securing the perimeter. They moved like they had done that 1,000 times before, walked over to and stood there in silence for a long moment. He did not know what to say. Fought beside many species over the years, but he had never seen anything like what he saw tonight. These small, soft creatures had held a line that should have broken. They had fought with a fury that made no sense, and now they were acting like it was nothing special. Looked up at him and nodded once. There was no pride in his eyes and no boasting in his manner. He simply went back to getting his wound treated, walked away with a strange feeling in his chest. It was not fear exactly. Did not know what it was, but for the first time in his long career as a warrior, he found himself unsure of what he was dealing with. These humans were something he did not understand, and that disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. Base Thea was lost, knew it within an hour of the first attack ending. The walls were broken in 2 men place and half their soldiers were dead or wounded. Commander gave the order to retreat to the secondary position 15 miles to the south. It would mean moving through dense jungle terrain with enemy patrols hunting them the entire way. It would mean leaving behind anyone too wounded to walk. That was the way. Were honored and the dying were given quick merciful ends so they would not slow down the living. When explained this to the human just stared at him with the strange eyes, then shook his head and said that they would not be leaving anyone behind. Told him that carrying the wounded would slow them down and get more people killed. Said he understood that. Then he turned to his soldiers and started organizing teams to carry the wounded on stretchers made from supply crates and torn fur. They were fools. He told them they were fools. The humans ignored him and kept working. Retreat began at dawn when the smoke from the burning bay would provide some cover. Moved at the front of the column with his remaining squad members. The humans spread themselves throughout the line so that every group of wounded had human soldiers protecting them. And Price walked near the middle where she could coordinate movement and respond to threats from any direction. Her was gone now, lost in the chaos of the night. All the information in her head instead and issued orders with quiet confidence. Found himself liking her more than he wanted to admit. She was not large or physically impressive by any standard, but she moved through the jungle like she belonged there. Her eyes never stopped scanning the trees. Her weapon was always ready. She reminded him of the hunting cats on his, small and soft until the moment they were not. The ambush came 3 hours into the march. Dread collective soldiers dropped from the trees without warning and the column exploded in chaos. Killed 2 of them before he fully understood what was happening. His training took over and his body moved without conscious thought. He heard screaming and gunfire and the terrible sound of blades cutting through armor. Then he heard something else. He heard the humans shouting to each other in their language. They were not screaming in fear or panic. Coordinating, they were fighting back as a unit even though they were spread thin across the entire column. A young human male named Danny Cole was near when the attack began. Danny was barely old enough to be called an adult by human standards. He had freckles on his face and a nervous habit of checking his weapon even when it did not need checking. When the Dread collective soldiers came down from the trees, Danny did not run or freeze or cry out for help. He threw himself in front of a wounded soldier and took a blade through his stomach. Happened. He saw Danny look down at the blade sticking out of his body with an expression of mild surprise. Then Danny raised his rifle and shot the enemy soldier in the face. Then he shot 2 more before his legs gave out and he collapsed on top of the wounded he had been protecting, finished the remaining enemies in that section, and then knelt beside the young human. Danny was still alive but barely. Blood was pooling beneath him and his breathing was wet and raw. Up with eyes that were already going distant. He tried to say something but no words came out. Then he smiled. He actually smiled at like they were friends sharing a private joke. And then Danny Cole died on the jungle floor of a planet that was not his home, protecting a soldier of a species that had mocked his kind just days before. Did not understand. He knelt there beside the body and he did not understand at all. The bush was broken after 15 minutes of brutal fighting. The humans had lost 3 of their own, including Danny. They had lost twice that number, but they were still moving. And Price was already getting the column back in order, attaining another wound this time to his leg, but he refused to be carried. He wrapped the wound tight and kept walking with a limp that got worse every hour. Watched the humans carry their dead along with their wounded. They would not leave the bodies behind. Asked why they were doing this. The extra weight would slow them down even more. It made no tactical sense. Looked at him with something that might have been pity. And he said that Danny had a mother back on Earth who would want to bury her son. He said that leaving Danny behind was not an option they would consider. Thought about his own people and their ways. When it died in battle, the body was left where it fell. The spirit was honored, but the flesh was just meat. He had always thought that was practical and wise. Now he was not so sure. Through the night, because dying meant dying, the Dread Collective was hunting them with tracking beasts and drone swarms. M kept them one step ahead, painting their route constantly and using the terrain to mask their movement. She did not sleep. None of the humans slept. They just kept moving and fighting and carrying the wounded through the endless dark jungle. Saw one human female, a Meg named Laura, work on wounded soldiers for 6 straight hours without rest. Hands were covered in blood that was both human and she did not treat her own people first. She treated whoever was most badly hurt regardless of species. Asked her why. Laura looked at him with tired eyes and said that pain was pain and blood was blood, and she did not see the difference. Then she went back to work on a soldier who had been cursing humans just yesterday. They reached a cave system that would give them shelter for a few hours. The column collapsed inside and soldiers fell where they stood, sat against a cold stone wall and watched the human. They were exhausted beyond words. Their faces were and their movements were slow, but they were still chaining weapons and setting up a watch rotation and making sure the wounded were comfortable. Limped over to where was sitting and lowered himself down with a grunt of pain. They sat in silence for a while. Asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he watched Dane Cole die. Why did you not leave the wounded behind? Why did your soldier die for one of mine? Why do you keep going when an insane creature would have stopped? Thought about it for a long moment. Then he said 5 words that would never forget. That is not who we are. Did not respond. He just sat there in the dark cave and tried to understand what kind of species the humans really were. They were not what anyone expected, and that was starting to frighten him in a way that no enemy ever had. It was cold and dark and smelled of blood and sweat. Outside, the enemy was hunting them with machines and beasts that could track scent across miles. Inside, the survivors huddled together and tried to stay quiet and stay alive. Could not sleep. His mind was too full of things he did not understand. He kept seeing Dan Cole smile at him before dying. He kept hearing say those 5 words. That is not who we are. What did that even mean? Enough creature defined itself by what it would not do rather than what it could do. He found himself walking through the cave until he reached the spot where the humans had gathered. They were sitting in a loose circle and speaking in low voices. And Price looked up when she saw him approach. She did not seem surprised. She just moved over slightly to make room for him to sit, hesitated for a moment, and then lowered himself to the ground beside her. He watched him with curious eyes, but no one told him to leave. Checking his wounded leg again. The bandage was soaked through with blood, but he showed no sign of pain. One of the younger humans, a male named Chris, was talking about his home. He spoke of a place called Montana where the sky was so big you could see forever. He spoke of mountains and rivers and a small house where his grandmother still lived. His voice was soft and full of longing. Realized that these humans were very far from everything they knew. They had come across the stars to fight and die on a world that meant nothing to them. They had come because someone asked them to help. He could not imagine any doing the same. His people fought for territory and honor and survival. They did not cross the galaxy to bleed for strangers. Asked him thinking and asked if he wanted to know something. Did not know where to begin, so he started with the simplest question. How long had humans been fighting wars? Em smiled, but it was not a happy smile. She told him that humans had been killing each other since before they had written language. She told him about wars that lasted decades and killed millions. She told him about weapons that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light. Told him about plagues that wiped out half their population and famines that starved whole nation. Listened with growing disbelief. His own species had fought wars, of course. Every species in the galaxy had conflict in their history, but the scale of human violence against their own kind was beyond anything he had imagined. These creatures had nearly destroyed themselves over and over again, and yet they were still here. They were still fighting. They were still spreading across the stars. For the conversation when M grew quiet, he told about human endurance. He spoke of soldiers in ancient times who marched for months across frozen mountains. He spoke of mechs who worked for days without sleep until their hands stopped shaking and their eyes stopped focusing. He spoke of ordinary people who refused to surrender even when surrender was the only sane choice. He told a story about a group of human soldiers who were surrounded and outnumbered and given the chance to give up. Answer was a single word they did not understand. Explained that the word was a refusal so absolute that it became legendary. Those soldiers had died to the last one, but they had not surrendered. Asked why. Shrugged and said that sometimes dying on your feet was better than living on your knees. It was not logical. It was not tactical. It was just human. Hours passed slowly in the dark cave. More humans shared their stories. They talked about athletes who ran until their bodies broke and then kept running. They talked about rescue workers who walked into burning buildings knowing they might not walk out. They talked about parents who lifted impossible weights to save their children. They talked about something called spite. This was a concept that had never encountered before. It explained that sometimes they kept going not because they thought they could win, but because they refused to give their enemies the satisfaction of seeing them fall. This was madness. There was beautiful madness that could not look away from, and leaned closer to him and said something that cut through everything else. She said that humans were afraid all the time. They were afraid of pain and death and failure and loss, but they had learned to do things while afraid. Had learned to keep moving even when every part of them screamed to stop. Something his teacher had told him when he was young. The old warrior had spoken of the gods who created the galaxy and all the species within it. He said the gods feared only one thing, a creature with nothing left to lose, had always thought that meant a creature without hope or purpose. Now he understood it differently. Humans always had something to lose. They had homes and families and futures they wanted to live for, but they fought as if they had already accepted that they might lose everything. Fought with the freedom of the doomed and the fury of the disparate. They did not fight to survive. They fought to matter. They fought so that their deaths would mean something even if their lives were cut short. This was what made them terrifying. They were not fearless. They were full of fear, but they had turned their fear into fuel. Round the circle at these strange soft creatures who had become something else entirely in his eyes, was cleaning his weapon with hands that never trembled despite his wounds, and was getting defensive positioned in the dirt with her finger. Chris was quietly humming a song from his distant home. Laura the medic was checking on sleeping wounded even though she had not rested in over 30 hours. They were exhausted and hurt and far from help. They should have been broken. Species would have been broken by now, but the humans just kept going. They kept caring for each other. They kept preparing for the next fight. Stood up slowly and the humans looked at him. He did not have words for what he was feeling, so he simply nodded at them. It was a gesture of respect that he had never offered to anyone outside his own species. Nodded back. No words were needed. Walked back to his own spot in the cave and sat down in the darkness. Did not sleep that night either, but now it was not confusion keeping him awake. It was something closer to awe. He had fought beside many warriors in his life. He had never fought beside anything like humans, and he was beginning to understand why even the gods might fear them. Broken Ridge on the third day of their retreat. It was a narrow mountain pass with steep walls on both sides and a thin path that only allowed 4 soldiers to walk side by side. On the other side of the pass was friendly territory. On this side was the enemy closing in fast. M had calculated that they were 6 hours ahead of the main Dread collective force. 6 hours to get over 100 wounded soldiers through a passage that would take at least 8 hours to cross. The numbers did not work. Knew the numbers did not work. Commander gathered the remaining officers and laid out the situation. Someone would have to stay behind and hold the pass while the wounded evacuated. Whoever stayed would not be leaving. It was a death sentence wrapped in tactical necessity. The commander asked for volunteers from the ranks. Before anyone could respond, stepped forward and said his squad would do it. The reaction of the soldiers around him. Some looked relieved that they would not have to die today. Others looked confused that humans would volunteer for certain death. A few looked ashamed in a way that understood completely. He felt that shame himself. These outsiders who had been mocked and dismissed were now offering to sacrifice themselves so that soldiers could live. Was already organizing his people. He had 17 humans left alive and able to fight. And soldiers to hold a pass against an army. Emma was at his side giving quiet orders and chain equipment. The other humans were saying goodbye to the wounded they had carried so far. There were no tears and no dramatic speeches. They just clasped hands and nodded and said simple things that carried weight beyond their words. Made his decision without thinking. He walked over to and said that he would stay. Looked at him for a long moment and then asked if he was sure. He was not sure of anything anymore, but he knew he could not walk away while these humans stood alone. There joined them, warriors who had fought beside the humans and learned to see them differently. Commander objected, but there was no time to argue. The wounded were already moving through the pass. The first sounds of any scouts could be heard in the jungle behind them. 21 soldiers to hold the line. It was not enough. It could never be enough, but just smiled and said they would make it enough. They set up positions along the entrance to the pass. Walls created natural that would force the enemy to bunch up and slow down, and calculated fields of fire and ammunition ratios with terrifying precision. She told them exactly how long they needed to hold. She told them that reinforcements might arrive if the distress signal let through. She did not promise anything. She just gave them the facts and let them decide what to do with those facts. Found himself respecting her more with every word she spoke. Collective arrived like a wave of darkness pouring out of the jungle. There were hundreds of them, many thousand. Their war machines crawled forward on metal legs, and their soldiers screamed battle cries that echoed off the mountain walls. Felt the old familiar surge of battle fury rise in his chest, but this time it was mixed with something else. He looked at the humans beside him and felt a connection he had never expected. These strange small creatures were his brothers and sisters now. Died together in the place, and their deaths would mean something. The first shots rang out and the battle began, fired with the same mechanical precision had seen on the first night. Each bullet found a target. Each movement was efficient and calm. The humans fought like they had been fighting together for years. They covered each other and supported each other and moved as a single unit, fell into their rhythm without effort. He had found something he did not know he was missing. Kept coming and the defenders kept killing them. Minutes stretched into hours. Ammunition ran low and wounds piled up. M took command seamlessly when was hit by shrapnel that tore through his side. He refused to stop fighting and she did not waste time arguing. She just adjusted her orders to account for his reduced mobility and kept the defense coordinated. One human after another fell. Chris went down protecting from a flanking attack. The medic was killed while dragging a wounded soldier to cover. Each death hit like a physical blow. These humans had become precious to him in a way he could not explain. But the living did not stop to mourn the dead. They kept fighting. They kept holding the line. A quiet human named Greg Palmer held a forward position alone for what felt like forever. He was wounded in the shoulder and the leg and the side. He should have been dead 3 times over. Greg just kept firing and reloading and firing again. When his ammunition finally ran out, he drew his combat knife and kept fighting. Watched Greg fall forward, still trying to stab an enemy soldier with his last breath. He fell forward, not backward. He died moving toward the enemy rather than away. Ours blurred together in a haze of blood and noise and desperate violence. Lost track of how many he killed. He lost track of his own wounds. He just kept fighting because the humans beside him kept fighting. Because stopping was not something they did. Because giving up was not who they were. When the reinforcements finally arrived, barely heard the new gunfire. He barely registered that the enemy was retreating. Kept swinging his blade until M grabbed his arm and told him it was over. He looked around at the pass that had become a graveyard. Bodies were piled so thick that the ground was invisible. Of the 21 soldiers who had stood at Broken Ridge, only 8 were still alive. Was unconscious but breathing. M had a wound across her face that would leave a scar. Had so many cuts and burns that he could not feel individual pain anymore. The humans who survived were helping each other stand. Cheering on the dead and closing the eyes of their friends. They were not celebrating victory. They were honoring sacrifice. Stood among them and felt something break inside his chest. It was not grief exactly. It was something larger and more permanent. He had been changed by what happened here. He would never see the galaxy the same way again. He had fought beside humans, and he finally understood what that meant. Terry Hospital on IV was quiet in a way that felt wrong after so much noise and violence. Lay in a bed that was too small for his body and stared at a ceiling that looked like every other ceiling he had ever seen. His wounds were healing, but something deeper had changed inside him. He could not stop thinking about the humans. He could not stop seeing their faces when he closed his eyes. The doctors told him he would make a full recovery in time. Did not understand that recovery was not what he was worried about. He was worried about going back to the life he had before. He was worried about forgetting what he had learned. He was worried about becoming the person who laughed when someone mentioned human soldiers. 3 weeks in the hospital was finally allowed to walk on his own. The first thing he did was find out where the surviving humans were being treated. They had been placed in a separate wing because their medical needs were different. Walked through corridors that seemed endless until he found the right room. Was sitting up in bed when entered. The human looked thin and pale, but his eyes were the same, calm and seeing more than they should. Rice was in a chair beside him with bandages covering half her face. She smiled when she saw, and the smile made her scar twist in a way that should have been ugly but was not. There were only 3 other humans in the room, 5 survivors from a squad of 30. The mathematics of sacrifice laid bare in imp beds. Down heavily in a chair that creaked under his weight. He did not know how to start the conversation he had been rehearsing in his head for weeks, or he just started talking. He told them about his life before this campaign. He told them about the 17 battles he had fought and the enemies he had killed and the honors he had earned. He told them that he had always believed there were the greatest warriors in the galaxy. He told them that he had been a fool, listened without interrupting. Finch the human was quiet for a long moment, then said that there were great warriors. He said there was no shame in past beliefs. He said the only shame would be in refusing to learn and grow. This was such a human thing to say, forgiving and practical and somehow kind even after everything that had happened. The question that had been burning in him since the battle at Brown Ridge. He asked why humans fought the way they did. He asked why death seemed to mean nothing to them. Thought about it for so long that wondered if he would answer at all. Then the human spoke slowly and carefully like he was choosing each word with great precision. He said that death meant everything to humans. He said that was exactly why they fought so hard, because the people beside them mattered more than their fear. The lives they were protecting were worth more than the lives they were risking, because dying for something was better than living for nothing. Felt those words settle into him like stones dropping into deep water. They sank through everything he thought he knew and came to rest at the bottom of his understanding. Later there was a memorial ceremony for the soldiers who died at Brown Ridge and during the retreat from Forward Base Theta, and Hugh and Dead were honored together for the first time in the history of USP. Was asked to speak because he was the highest-ranking survivor of the battle. He stood before an audience of hundreds and looked at faces from a dozen different species. News of what happened had spread across the city. Wanted to know about the humans who held the pass against impossible odds. Everyone wanted to understand what kind of creatures these newcomers really were. Had prepared words, but he set them aside when he reached the podium. He spoke from his heart instead. Them about Dan Cole, who died protecting a stranger. He told them about Laura, who healed anyone in pain regardless of species. He told them about Greg Palmer, who fell forward. He told them about Emma and all the humans who kept fighting when an insane creature would have stopped. He told them about the conversations in the dark cave and the stories the humans shared. Them about spite and stubbornness and the strange, beautiful madness of fighting to matter rather than fighting to survive. Then he said the words that would be repeated across the galaxy for years to come. He said that he had fought beside humans and finally learned why even the gods fear them. He said it was not their strength because many species were stronger. It was not their weapons because many species had better technology. It was not their numbers because they were still small and new among the stars. What made humans terrifying was that they would never stop. They would crawl through fire and blood and death itself, and they would keep coming. Not for glory and not for conquest and not for territory. They kept coming for each other. The audience was silent when he finished. Then the applause began. It started with the human survivors and spread outward until the entire hall was thundering with it. Stepped down from the podium and walked to where was sitting. The human stood up slowly and offered his hand. Had learned the gesture. He took the hand and gripped it firmly. No words were needed between them. They had become something that went beyond species or cultural language. Become brothers forged in the worst fire the galaxy could offer. A week later filed a formal request with High Command. He asked to be permanently assigned to human forces as a liaison and advisor. The request was approved without debate. Word had spread about what happened at Brown Ridge. They were looking at humans differently now. Everyone was looking at humans differently. Packed his few belongings and boarded a transport ship heading for Earth. He did not know what he would find there. Did not know what his future held, but he knew that he had found something worth standing beside. He had found a species that fought like the universe itself was trying to stop them, and they simply refused to listen. He had found humans, and he would never forget why even the gods feared them.